Throughout the second half of the 18th century, the western frontier was here, just west of the Appalachian mountain chain. But now, having made the Louisiana Purchase, the frontier, the western frontier of the United States, is going to shift farther west to roughly here in the early years of the 19th century, the other side of the Mississippi River, essentially. Not Texas, well, not Texas because it belongs to Spain, but there'll be plenty going on in Texas that the U.S. will become involved with in the same time period. But despite the fact that we have shifted our western frontier in our narrative here, we are going to go back once again to that area just west of the Appalachian Mountains called the Old Northwest and the Old Southwest, because in the early years of the 19th century, the early 1800s, there's going to be basically one more really big series of events in that region that are going to sort of close out Western expansion for that region. And that starts with these guys. Tecumseh, whom we've mentioned before, Shawnee warrior, who had come down with his older brother to become a part of the Chickamauga group during the Chickamauga Wars in the late 1780s, early 1790s, and who had then returned to his native Ohio. Well, it is now about 20 years later. He has grown quite a bit in wisdom and in ability. He is a seasoned warrior, very experienced, and he had learned a lot from Dragging Canoe, leader of the Chickamaugas. The other guy to the right is his younger brother, Tenskwatawa, who is usually known as the Shawnee Prophet. He's very similar to Neolin, the Delaware prophet. The similar kind of vision that he had, that united different tribes together. The idea that the native peoples were suffering because they had abandoned their traditional ways and had become too enmeshed with the white man, had become too invested in trying to live like white people. And the message, the visions received by Tenskwatawa essentially translated into, if we will return to the traditional ways, then we will be blessed and we will regain our lands. So this is half a century, 50 years almost, after Neolin's prophecies in the Ohio country had led to Pontiac and others leading a pan-tribal resistance to the British. Now, when we talked about Neolin, I said that that's going to kind of set a pattern. So Tenskwatawa is definitely a big part of that pattern. There were others that I'm not going to talk about right now, but people like, for example, Handsome Lake among the Iroquois. There were prophets arising among the Cherokees and among several different tribes, all of whom had kind of a similar, to varying degrees, type of vision. It was a very prophetic time period for native peoples east of the Mississippi, and that's because it was a very dire time period, as they had lost more and more of their lands, of their independence, of their autonomy. Well, just like with Neolin and Pontiac, here you've got a duo in which you have a spiritual leader that inspires people across many tribes, and coupled with him you have a brilliant military leader who is able to sort of use to his advantage or to his people's advantage the fact that the spiritual imagery created by the prophet is binding people together. So in the history books, as they were written in the 1800s and into the 1900s and all the way, for all I know, if this even gets mentioned in public schools, it must have at least a brief mention, Tecumseh and the prophet. The way it's always portrayed is that there was a spiritual leader. We're talking about Neil and Pontiac. We're talking about Tecumseh, Tenskwatawa, and others that would come afterward. There's a spiritual leader that is presented by white America, essentially, as weird, as superstitious, like some kind of witch doctor that's sort of maybe a little bit of a con artist, maybe a little bit of a foolish person. That's how it's, and then the other leader, the military leader, Pontiac, Tecumseh, and others, is absolutely brilliant and is almost a match for the advancing progress of civilization. Almost, but not quite, but makes a noble effort. So what I just told you, that is not objectively how it was, but that's how it was presented, and for all I know, is still being presented. But the fact is that whether you're talking about Pontiac's war in 1763, or you're talking about the wars of Tecumseh, circa 1810 to 1814 or so, it is the spiritual leader that the people are inspired by and whom they follow. And the military leader, and in both these cases it is indeed a brilliant leader, is only able to accomplish the things that he does in unifying many tribes because of the spiritual movement. And that's something that, white America found difficult to understand, and probably still does. And so therefore the emphasis is always on how great the military leader was. All that being said, Tecumseh, leader of this of a Shawnee band, established a new town on the Wabash River in Indiana Territory, and they named it Prophetstown for the prophet. They, among other things, opposed the sale of any further Indian lands to the United States. Now, Tecumseh, brilliant strategist and tactician, but also a brilliant orator and politician, was able to basically reassemble the Western Confederacy that had crumbled almost 20 years before. All those tribes, most of them Algonquin speaking, there in the Ohio country, all came together under the overall influence of Tecumseh, and he even left that region and traveled south into the old Southwest to the territories of the five civilized tribes, as they would later be called, the Choctaws and Creeks and Cherokees and Chickasaws and Seminoles, to try to get them to join in his quest, in his pan-Indian intertribal quest to hold the line against any further American expansion. His archenemy in Indiana Territory is the military governor of Indiana Territory, William Henry Harrison. We mentioned him briefly before in a letter that President Thomas Jefferson wrote to him. He's the military governor of the territory. While Tecumseh is off on his diplomatic tour trying to raise support from other tribes his brother Tenskwatawa is in charge not just of the spiritual stuff, but as leader of the town, in Prophetstown. Turns out Tenskwatawa, not the brilliant military tactician his brother was. He was outmaneuvered and decisively defeated by U.S. forces under William Henry Harrison in 1811 at the Battle of Tippecanoe. Later on, Harrison, much later on, about 30 plus years later, William Henry Harrison is going to run for president, and his campaign slogan is going to be based on his old nickname, because after this battle, he becomes known as Old Tippecanoe. So when he runs for president with John Tyler as his running mate, the campaign slogan is Tippecanoe and Tyler too. So that's where that comes from. All right. Meanwhile, while all this is going on, this is 1811, as 1812 rolls around, there is a clamor for war, as the British have returned to their old practice of kidnapping American sailors and basically forcibly drafting them into the British Navy and other things. Also, this is kind of a complex story that I go into much more detail about in other classes. But also there are several Southern congressmen who become known as Warhawks, who want to go to war with Britain, who, by the way, around this time is being occupied by Napoleon. Not that England is being physically occupied, but that's what's keeping them busy. Go to war with England to grab some territory. They hope to grab Canada and add it to the United States. Maybe grab Florida, which the English now nominally kind of have control over. That kind of shifts back and forth between the English and the Spanish. So we're not going to go into any more real detail about the beginning of the war or the war itself. Hopefully you have some background about it. Now, it is ironic that when Congress votes for a declaration of war, and it's all Democratic Republicans and no Federalists who vote for the war. It's very partisan. This idea of going to war with England was very popular in the South and in the Democratic Republican Party. Very unpopular in the North, especially New England. But President Madison signs Congress's declaration of war on June the 1st, and war begins, with no one having received the news yet that the British Prime Minister, who had been behind the various policies that America didn't like, was dead. He had been assassinated, and he had been replaced by someone much friendlier to the U.S., but that didn't matter, because now the fighting starts, and as you are no doubt aware, there was a lot of fighting on land, and also a lot of fighting, well, I was going to say at sea. There's fighting at sea, but there's also a lot of fighting in the water, in the Great Lakes. And you're probably aware that at one point the British Army occupies Washington, D.C. and burns down the White House. So that was a big strike big strike to American morale. Then the war winds down. There's one big battle that takes place actually after the war ended. It's another one of those stories where they hadn't got the news yet. Battle of New Orleans, when General Andrew Jackson leads a force of Tennessee volunteers combined with citizens of New Orleans, combined with French pirates, combined with Choctaw Indians to defend the city against the British, and has a big decisive victory against the British. And most people didn't know that the treaty ending the war had already been signed at that time. It didn't take away from Jackson's public acclaim as a result of this action. So there, I just summed up the War of 1812 in about 2 minutes. I will mention that the effort that the U.S. made twice to invade Canada. Both of those times they were beaten back by the British. But what we're going to do is actually spend a little more time talking about the Indian front of the War of 1812. So there's fighting going on all over the place. In the Old Northwest, that is the Midwest, there was already fighting going on with the Indians under the leadership and inspiration of Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa. So Tecumseh makes an alliance with the British, much as the Shawnee had done during the American Revolution. So they're on the side of the British. He even Tecumseh is made a British general, and the Indians under his command are considered part of the British Army. He gets himself a nice red suit and everything. Meanwhile, his diplomatic trip to the South had resulted in not a whole lot, because he had gone to the Choctaws and Chickasaws saying, "Join us in our war," and they had said, "No, thank you very much." Because remember, after 1794, I had said that most southern tribes have figured out they cannot win a military confrontation against the United States. So the Choctaws and the Chickasaws are like, no way. The Cherokees, also, no way, no desire to be involved. He goes to the Creek Nation. Now remember, I think I've mentioned before that the Seminoles really only came about as a separate group from the Creeks in the late 1700s. Seminoles were basically Muskogean people, Creek Indians, who had moved into Florida and who had accepted a lot of runaway slaves. Well, so the Seminoles at this point, much more traditionalist than the other four tribes. Well, Tecumseh had gone to the Creek Indians, the Muskogee tribe, trying to get support from them. The official leadership of the Creek Nation said, no way, just like all the other southern tribes had said. But a whole contingent of Creek Indians who were more traditionalist than the leadership who had rejected Tecumseh, they agreed to go to war against the United States. And so in the culture of most southern tribes, white means peace, red means war. And so essentially, in a metaphorical way, a vote had been taken, and in a vote you would raise a stick with a particular color to register your vote, right? So those who were in favor of peace with the United States were called white sticks. Those in favor of going to war were red sticks, and it was divided, very divided. This turned into a Creek Civil War. Sometimes it's called the Creek War, which is misleading, because it was only a war against about half the Creeks, with the other half of the Creeks on the American side, the U.S. side. More accurate definition or appellation is the Red Stick War, in which these Red Stick Creeks are fighting against Red Stick Creeks with some Seminole support, are fighting against the United States and the U.S.'s Indian allies in the South, the Cherokees and the Choctaws, who both of whom send military contingents to back up the the U.S. Army. So actually, a lot of Choctaw and Cherokee leaders were involved in this war on the side of the U.S., including a young lieutenant named John Ross, or Guiskui, from the Cherokees, that we will no doubt be mentioning again before too long. Well, So this happens. Now, why did Tecumseh have no success anywhere in the South except with some of the Creeks, the more traditionalist Creeks? Well, there's a reason for that, possibly, and that is that Tecumseh, who is Shawnee, remember we talked about how his father had been killed in Lord Dunmore's war back in 1774-75. Tecumseh is Shawnee. His mother was Creek. Shawnee are patrilineal. Creek are matrilineal. What that means is that essentially Tecumseh, in a sense, had dual citizenship, because the Shawnees considered him Shawnee because his dad was, but the Creeks considered him a relative because of his mother. So perhaps that's why he was able to persuade a number of them to come over to his side. Well, that's going on in the South. In the North, the Shawnees and their various allies, like I said, they side with the British. And the Shawnees in particular are a line of defense when the British Army has to fall back, when the Americans are trying to invade Canada. So in a battle called the Battle of the Thames, not far from Detroit, Tecumseh was killed in battle. He was killed in battle, but the action of the Shawnees enabled the British to sort of retrench and refortify and prevent the Americans from taking Canada. So, oddly enough, Tecumseh is in some ways considered a Canadian national hero, very celebrated, even though he wasn't from Canada. He was actually from Ohio, and he didn't even really die in Canada, but he was close to it. Point is, though, that he has, with his passing, that leads to the dissolution of his confederacy that he had been able to put together with all the different tribes. So it all kind of dies out with him. And so that was the last big push east of the Mississippi for a pan-Indian resistance to the United States. Well, in the South, meanwhile, the Red Stick War is going on, and it's a similar situation to what had happened in 1780s and 90s, where you've got the United States fighting against Southern Indians and Great Lakes area Indians at the same time, like a two-front thing. In Alabama, in 1813, a contingent of Red Stick Creeks besieged an American fort, Fort Mims, about 35 miles north of Mobile, Alabama, and overran the fort and killed almost everyone in it, which included not only the soldiers, but civilians as well. So that led to a big sort of rallying cry for revenge against the Red Stick Creeks. A lot of White Stick Creeks had been among the civilians there. Well, at this point, General Andrew Jackson, who has not fought the Battle of New Orleans yet, he's in command of American forces fighting against the Red Stick Creeks. And finally, at a place called Horseshoe Bend in Alabama, the American forces led by Jackson, which included a contingent of Tennessee volunteers, as well as regular army, as well as Choctaw, Cherokee, and White Stick Creeks, had kind of a last big battle against the Red Stick Creeks and defeated them very decisively, with the result being that after they lost, the Creeks were forced to give up most of their land in Georgia and Alabama. And Andrew Jackson was the person that laid out the American terms there. And remember, half the Creeks had been on Andrew Jackson's side. They lost their land too. Going to turn out he's not that great a friend to the Indians. One Cherokee who had actually saved Jackson's life during the battle later expressed regret that he had done so, for reasons we'll get into soon. Now, the last thing that I want to mention about the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, just to kind of help it stick in your mind, is I want to introduce a new character into the narrative, a young officer, promising young officer, I think he was a captain, named Sam Houston of Tennessee. Sam Houston gets injured at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in what was described euphemistically as a grievous wound. How grievous was it? He got shot in the crotch with an arrow. And you ever notice that arrowheads are shaped like arrowheads? That's because those little fluted ends, the purpose of that is that once they stick in you, it's hard to pull them out. So he had this arrow sticking out of his groin right there on the battlefield, and the battlefield doctor was there, and they couldn't pull this thing out. So the only way to get it out was to push it completely through and out the other side, which they did. And that's a grievous wound. It was such a grievous wound that it led to basically an open, oozing wound that never completely healed, never completely shut together, which was something that caused Houston a lot of physical pain and would cause him other kinds of pain as well. So later on, about 20 years after this, Sam Houston has become the governor of the state of Tennessee. And he's engaged to a young woman who is a scion of one of the most prominent Nashville families. And they get married. He was a bachelor when he became governor. They get married, and then there is a huge controversy because his new bride basically runs screaming from the governor's mansion on her wedding night and refuses to go back, and seems kind of traumatized, and she won't talk about it, and he won't talk about it. But it was a scandal. It was a scandal because people started saying, Sam Houston, he's always hanging out with those Cherokees, and he had indeed made friends with many Cherokees in this battle, or in this war, the Red Stick War. He's hanging out with there's no telling what kind of horrible sexual habits he picked up that he tried to inflict on this poor young woman, and now she's had to flee for her life. Well, the scandal led to Houston actually resigning as governor of Tennessee and deciding to move to Texas, which at that time was part of Mexico, but was about to enter into a war against Mexico for its independence, which Houston would be in the commanding general of, and would later be the president of Texas, and then the governor of Texas, senator from Texas, etc., etc. So you should know Sam Houston. Perhaps you're familiar with the city named after him in Texas. Odds are that what happened at the governor's mansion, I think a good likelihood, and some other historians have said this, is what happened was his new bride got a look at that gaping, oozing, grievous injury and decided that that's just something she couldn't look at every day or every night, and so called it all off. Regardless, he wound up abandoning Tennessee and marching into Texas history. But I like to tell this story in connection with Horseshoe Bend because I find, to my great surprise, that usually anymore, when I ask students almost none of them have heard of Sam Houston, which, is something that would have been unheard of a generation or two ago. And I like to think that once you know about that arrow in his groin, if for nothing else, you'll remember the name of Sam Houston. All right, so all this comes to a conclusion here. The Confederacy that Tecumseh had put together is defeated at the end of the War of 1812, which kind of ends in a draw, with each side giving back the territories that it had gained from the other. The Red Stick War, or the Creek War, is ended, and the Creeks lose a large portion of their lands. It was from Horseshoe Bend that Jackson's forces marched then westward to New Orleans for that big battle. A couple of years after that, actually a little over a year after that, the Seminole Wars began, and in a way the first Seminole War was really kind of just an extension of the Red Stick War, and that takes place in Florida, and Andrew Jackson is in charge there, and U.S. forces eventually win over. Jackson actually invades Florida, which was a Spanish possession. Anyway, that's all very complex and long story. The short end of the story is that this, other than the Seminoles, is going to be the end of that Native American resistance. Seminoles will keep fighting on, actually, for another 20 years or so. All right. Well, let's now see what happened next.